So I expected most of the speakers, and I got to say that lineup is pretty legit. You should definitely let me know when Scott's in town from Gitcoin, because I haven't seen him in a bit, and it'd be fun to catch up. You have a great lineup ahead of you. I know many of those people, and I at least know of the rest of them. All of them will be able to go into a vertical very effectively. I figured as a starting point, this would probably be better to be more of a horizontal. I'm going to be covering a lot of weird, random stuff. I think I might have 2 slides on things that I am personally working on, but everything in here is something that I think very deeply about, and that's a lot of where the space is going. As Kuhn said, that I lead the team that used to be Protocol Labs research. We now bundled in a bunch of things that act like research, but isn't in fact research. These are things like how to build better infrastructure for like research, in that it's hard to know when you've succeeded. It's hard to know how valuable it's going to be up front. It's hard to know how much you should pay for these things. These are problems that show up outside of just research, and they show up in a lot of Web3 in a lot of places. And so I've taken on the task of, within Protocol Labs, trying to solve this for as much of the ecosystem as I can. So with that, I'm talking mostly about an introduction to Web3 generally, and why, in my opinion, it matters. You'll see a lot of, like, what is Web3? And this is a little bit less of that, and a little more emphasis on the subtitle there. Just a quick survey to get a sense, and I'm pretty sure this will be valuable to the teaching team as well. I'm curious, how many of you would consider yourselves casual investors in crypto? Seem to be about 20%. How many of you are interested in building something, see yourself as potentially like a CTO of some sort, or early engineer? That might be about 50%. How many would you consider yourselves more of the builder on the operations side, where you see yourselves more a CEO rather than a CTO or a chief science officer? Maybe about 20%. How many of you would consider yourselves casual observers who just kind of want to know what's going on here? All right, that might be about 50 or 60%. And then how many of you are just skeptics and want to be able to shit on everything and anything I say, ask hard questions? I look forward to challenges from everyone who raised hands. Please, I have about 30 slides, and probably more than 1 minute a slide, and I will probably talk to them pretty quickly. So I look forward to getting hard questions, challenges, etc., either here or afterward at the pizza hangout. I will also add a disclaimer. There's a lot of opinions in this. The opinions are mine. They're not Protocol Labs. I will probably connect more things and identify a bunch of things more than I will explain any individual things. But I also plan to do a lot of referencing, so you can dig into those things more at your leisure. And I will also have a QR code that will link these slides to you at the end of the slideshow. So every single link, don't bother writing it down, don't worry about it. I'll leave that slide up as I take questions, and you can come take a picture of it afterward if you want. That should be very easy to get a hold of me or the slides. Last up, I will highlight these two, this question and this topic from the course description. Hopefully this will be interesting to you. These are probably the 2 areas that I will focus on the most. Lastly, I would say that my personal goal for this particular remainder of the hour is to convince you that there are very reasonable and fairly knowledgeable people in the Web3 space, the DWeb space, who have fairly robust theories of change, plans that they are implementing to achieve potentially incredibly ambitious goals. If I can accomplish that, I'll consider this a victory, even if I can only convince a few of you of that. I can't really start off with what is Web3 without defining Web 1 and Web 2. For those of you who aren't in computer science or haven't taken a networking or electrical engineering course related to this, the internet itself is generally the wires and the very basic communication for how the computers connect to each other. And on top of that, humans built the web. Web 1.0 is a static internet where you can take data from one machine and view it on another. Very simple. These are internet protocols that these are internet applications that you may or may not call applications, may or may not have actually dealt with at your age. because these are kind of spelunking into the history of the internet. That said, it was eventually replaced with a lot of these applications where you were interacting not with the data directly, but you were dealing with some application that facilitated the interaction with the data itself. This is much more interactive. You can picture these kinds of things where the server is running some program, takes input from you before giving you output, as opposed to a very static HTML page where it's the same content. Different people will emphasize different parts of. I would like to emphasize that this is a verifiable web, a self-sovereign web, some might say. It's an internet where you aren't limited to central providers who hold the data, who run the applications, who get to decide when the application changes. I'm sure each of you could imagine what it would be like to have something like a Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, where instead of only having one newsfeed algorithm, you got to choose your own. That's the kind of thing that you should expect from a potential Web3 future. As I really enjoyed this particular blog post titled "The Myth of the Infrastructure Phase." You may, as you talk through startup-y, like with startup people, and again, all of these links will be in the slides, and there will be a QR code to the slides at the end. There's this idea that you need to develop infrastructure before you develop the applications that sit on top of that infrastructure. And I will emphasize that this blog post does a great job of dismantling that, both through logic and through examples. I will highlight the fact that the light bulb was invented before the electrical outlet and plug. Everything, all the appliances in your home that were electric used to screw into the light bulb because that was the first interface, and you would like take out the light bulb to turn on, or to use your vacuum. Weird tangent, but the relevance is that you shouldn't expect to see the most obvious things being built as infrastructure. You should expect to see the things that will become incredibly common showing up in a few specific applications before those things get universalized. And so one thing I like to highlight about Web3 that I feel is really underemphasized is that there are a few things where in Web 2, there are applications like Figma or Google Docs or Gather.town. I assume everyone's used one of those at this point. Okay, not even worth asking. The value that those systems bring you is your ability to work with other people on a thing. Like, no one goes to Google Docs because they really want to see a blank Google Doc or the fonts that are available within like Google Drive. They go there to interact with other people. And the power of Web3 is that you will be able to interact with other people on your own terms instead of on the terms of a Google or a Facebook. I would say, I will reemphasize that this is not intended to be a standalone explainer of what Web3 is. I really like these two. One from the CEO of Protocol Labs, who invented the two main protocols that Protocol Labs is known for, and another from our head of ecosystem. Both of these are really great explainers, going to far more depth of like roughly the previous two and the next two slides than I will go. When it comes to pros and cons of Web 2, I will highlight that there's a fair bit of misdirection in terms of what you experience, what you are limited to, what you can choose, and what you can opt into or opt out of. It's very easy in the current zeitgeist to look at this and make jokes about it, and the things that I think we should be paying attention to are things more like this, where it was made clear that recently that law enforcement could access information from Ring, which is owned by Amazon, and they didn't need the permission of the owner of the camera in order to access that. And if you look at the interface, it was made public and it is easily capable of being abused. I will also highlight, as another example, it's easy to make fun of barbecue sauce on a bookshelf. But the thing that is more important to realize is that there are many, many people for whom Facebook is the internet. And this should be somewhat terrifying to technologists in the room. Anyone who plans to build, or like anyone who understands or tries to understand the value that a global connectivity communication network provides us should be concerned that this is not just what's happening in developing countries, but it's something that could happen when you hear pressure toward some of these companies moving into the metaverse as a space. I imagine all of you might recognize that Facebook is not the internet, but would you necessarily recognize that a Meta Platforms Inc. product is not the metaverse when that arrives? Anyway, I don't want this to seem personal. I don't want to target any particular company. Another very important thing that I would highlight from this is that this is not a symptom of CEOs in tech, I would claim. I think that this is a systemic incentive problem that is growing out of the fact that when we have centralized services that Web2 provides, what you end up with is a revenue model based on attention, based on advertising revenue, based on how addictive can people make things and how much can they monetize the data that they are extracting from users to whom they are giving free or cheap or at least generally beneficial services. So that kind of leads us toward what would a different incentive model look like? I have a few, like, welcome to Web3. These might be the questions that come to mind first. The first being, why is Bitcoin important? Obviously worth noting that Bitcoin like Web3 is far more than just Bitcoin. But to those of you who haven't come across this, I would definitely recommend this particular explainer of what it means to own a Bitcoin and how Bitcoin actually works. I really like 3 Blue 1 Brown for math explainers generally. If you have any math concept from linear algebra to Fourier transforms, would definitely recommend one of their videos. Another Stanford grad, fun fact. One of the benefits of, like, generally, Bitcoin is this currency-like system where anyone can participate. Your incentives are included in the protocol itself. And I think it's really important to note that when you have cryptocurrencies or blockchain systems, you need to have everything that is in the domain or the regime of that project exist or be able to be reached in a computable way. So Bitcoin is secured by the fact that there's some amount of energy being dedicated to inverting lossily inverting a hard-to-invert function. This is, I'm sure you've all heard about Bitcoin hashing and how there are racks of GPUs that are trying to hash to solve math puzzles is probably the resolution that you may have gotten at some point in your learning journey. I think Bitcoin is important not for the, it's a store of value, it's a robust currency, but because it was, before Bitcoin, very, very difficult for a program to handle money or create a bank account, and now it's a few lines of code. And this is something, I will usually agree to some extent and disagree at least a little bit with any other claim of why Bitcoin is important, but this is a fundamental shift where, currency is now computable. We have found a way to generate digital scarcity. It used to be believed that the way that you had to have, it used to be believed that you couldn't have digital money because any string of bits could just be duplicated and you can counterfeit trivially. And if this wasn't a question that came up yet, this is welcome to the beginning of your cryptocurrency journey. But the breakthrough of Bitcoin was we have basically one database. Everyone has the same copy of it. And if they have multiple copies of it, there's a deterministic mechanism for identifying the one that is the canonical source. And so Bitcoin has this ledger. It's a series of entries about who has how many tokens. And the way that you maintain that scarcity is that you have a series of rules about what is a valid update. and those things include the number of tokens in have to be the number out. In order to move from one account to another, you need a cryptographic signature to validate that the owner of or the controller of that first wallet or account is acquiescing to the transfer, and that only a certain amount of new tokens are able to be generated at each instance. This is the block reward, and that goes to the individual or entity that propagated the database. So you have a built-in incentive for making sure the database continues to exist. That is roughly what a blockchain is. It's a very slow database that has a bunch of weird properties. Those include an auditable public history, often a native token, but not always, often a verifiable leader election, often some creative features to try and increase the throughput to be less of a slow, or to be a database that is less slow than it might naturally be. There are a lot of really good flowcharts that I would say are probably the best avenue into understanding all the various aspects of these. If you Google, should I use a blockchain flowchart, you'll easily find like 6 or 7 that are really good in that they all highlight different properties in which you might realize that there's a very subtle difference between why you might use a blockchain for this particular thing or some other type of database. And this is obviously a thing enough that there's an XKCD around it. I'll also note that if you look at the slides, I do have speaker notes. They're not showing up to me here, but they do have additional context on some of these things. I would love to take a question from a skeptic at this point. I think I'm doing okay on time, and if someone's like, this is ridiculous.
Okay, I'll go.
Thank you.
So you highlighted a bunch of problems with Web 2.
Yep.
And my question is, why couldn't those problems be solved through regulation or changing marketing incentives, for example?
Absolutely can. The question becomes, is it easier to change it through regulation, where ostensibly you need to get buy-in from a ruling coalition of citizens and representatives, or is it easier to build a better product that people migrate to and can, where it's those user protections are built in? Or could you imagine some weird hybrid solution where you have tools that people become familiar with, innovate with in their free time, and then go and bring those governance mechanisms into from a Web3 world into their state or local or federal governments. At the end of the day, things happen because people want them to happen either on a microscopic scale or a macroscopic scale, and governance is as valid a tool as any other. Governance through federal regulation, I think, is as reasonable a path to change global human behavior as governance through novel product deployment, people choosing that product, and the question becomes, what becomes the easier path to pursue, or faster, or less risky? Multiple metrics you could apply there.
Great, thanks.
Take one more and then move on.
Question about your point on how Bitcoin made money really easy to program in a few lines of code. So the first thing I kind of thought about was how Stripe's kind of mission is to make an API that makes money easy to program with a few lines of code. So can you go more over those problems you were talking about?
So I would specifically highlight that there's a significant amount of know your customer and anti-money laundering regulation Stripe might have to go through. You also might personally not agree with the what your country's regulations or constraints are on what monetary flows are just or reasonable, and very mechanically, if you want to be approved as someone transacting through a Stripe or a PayPal automatically, it is more than just a few lines of code. There are definitely identity hurdles. In addition to that, there are potential robust reasons why outside of the United States you might want there to exist systems that can defy or subvert local governments. Oh. Okay, one more.
Do people care that they're the product? Do they care about ownership? Like they should?
I think they should.
They should, but do that.
I think that when people know they are the product, and when people identify the difference between being the product and a different system in which they are not the product, they are much more likely to choose to not be the product. I guess going back to like this kind of a system, if you could choose to, like knowing this, if you could choose to not buy Ring, would that sway your decision? Would having a different a different option be enough to sway your decision? Would you need like robustly audited code of an open source like survey smart doorbell alternative in order to do that? There is a continuum of how much education you need to get to people, and I truly hope and expect that we can have a more well-informed and like robustly engaged population than we do now, and that is in any democracy really the fundamental like baseline for civilization.
What do you think it'll take for regular people to know where that line is, or know that there is a line?
So the question was, what do you think it will take for regular people to identify the line or the boundary? And I think that boundary is different for different people fundamentally, and that's an aspect of humanity that's more or less unavoidable. I'm going to be moving on, and I will look forward to the discussion after this.
We have about 15 minutes.
Oh, all right then. NFTs. You've heard of them. Why can't I right-click save an image? And like, why doesn't that kill NFTs? There is value that we have outside of the raw utility of an object as humans. That is fundamental. And the thing that I would hope for you to like start considering after this, although that instead of, but I can right-click save these images, what does it even matter to fund these, is the fact that there are artists who are now funding themselves by generating free art that you can enjoy, and they are able to receive patronage. Wouldn't it be amazing if we'd produced all art like this so everyone could enjoy it and the artists could still generate revenue and be like receive the types of funding that we would want them to have through this kind of patronage model. I would love to see right-click saving for like ebooks in the same way they see it for images. You might be asking why DAOs are interesting. I think that DAOs are the minimal overlap, the computer scientists' purest abstraction of these entities. All of them roughly have a way of tracking membership and a way of allocating scarce resources. This is why I think DAOs are interesting. You roughly have the ability with Bitcoin to transact internationally with a few line of codes as a teenager in your parents' basement. You can do the same thing with blockchains, with respect to like creating international, or creating securities. You can do the same thing with DAOs, except you're creating international corporations with a few friends on the internet. This was going to fundamentally change all of how humans interact in a web native way, because so many more of the things that were limited to a single jurisdiction are now embedded on the internet in a more internet native way. I would say generally, I extend that particular idea of like, we have a world where there is jurisdictions, there are companies, there are organizations in these various forms, and you should expect that we will see the analog of those arise. I have a hot take on the Ethereum DAO hack fork as the legitimate use of force in the political science perspective, in the political science sense. as like in an internet domain, but I don't think it's worth going into that. Hanlon's razor is described as, or is usually framed as, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. And I feel like there's a better earlier quote by Goethe that misunderstandings and lethargy produce more wrong in the world than deceit and malice do, and at least the latter are certainly rarer. Going back to what I was saying about the incentive structure of Web 2 generally being one of walled gardens and ownership and monetizing free services, I think that by pushing for a direction where we have organizations that generate themselves, support themselves, and become more robustly independent, rather than being these more like free service and rent extraction type systems, will lead to huge benefits. I would say there's generally an incentive landscape where people have some driving interest in what they can do, what they know they can do, and what will benefit them. And because everyone follows their own little individual incentive gradient, we end up with the world ending up in suboptimal situations. I'm reminded of the adage that no individual raindrop feels responsible for the flood. But we can definitely create global incentives. We can create organizations that are better structured. And I'm realizing that I'm probably going to want to spend more time towards the end and want to focus more on concrete things, because I feel like I'm talking at a very high level. In terms of what I see Web3 generating, we are building for the internet generally in a borderless, nation-state agnostic way, a medium of exchange, a storage of value, a mechanism to regulate supply for stability and growth, probably in the near future. We are building property rights into virtual spaces. If you think about NFTs as the most robust way of establishing who owns what in a shared communal virtual space, it becomes much more obvious what NFTs could be useful for in a VR or AR metaverse. And additionally, having organizations that exist solely in the internet and may or may not choose to be controlled under the jurisdiction of some number of nation states is something that I think we will start to see crypto groups leaning more into increasingly strongly. And so we start to see a world where we have an internet native and internet first set of internet first world with money, property, and organizations. And I think this is incredibly compelling. I would shamelessly plug a fireside chat that I had that touches on a bit of this. We're seeing the construction of infrastructure for this world already. A very brief, a little bit more on Protocol Labs, because it would be a little bit probably be frowned upon for me not to explain what Protocol Labs does, what my company is trying to do with respect to all of this. We're most known for IPFS and Filecoin. IPFS generates makes the web work in a peer-to-peer way, where rather than computers all connecting to a central server, they connect to each other. And if some subset are separated from the network, they can still communicate. And that should have been, we generated the library to help these computers connect directly to each other. It is popular enough that it now runs the baseline of Polkadot and Ethereum in addition to our blockchain Filecoin. In IPFS, you can store things and share them in a content-addressed way. That means that you store what you care about, you give it to anyone who wants it. We like to liken it more to referencing books by a ISBN rather than by where they happen to sit in the library. With that system, you can store things and ask for them, but you can't pay people to store them. Filecoin is a blockchain that we developed that, and in terms of dates, it's worth mentioning that IPFS was proposed and first developed in 2014. Filecoin was also first proposed in 2014, but it took the development of zero-knowledge succinct arguments of knowledge, ZK snarks. In order for this to be reasonably buildable, it was reproposed more robustly and concretely in 2017 and launched in 2020. You can hire people to store your data, and they will generate proofs that your data is continuing to be stored. We also have built products like NFT.storage, where because of the incentive from the block reward for Filecoin, your NFTs will be stored for free on IPFS and Filecoin. We also built out a team of people to develop a distributed randomness beacon. These are all, I would say, examples of Web3 infrastructure. Many of them, I guess all of them with the exception of NFT.storage, are things that are facing toward the toward developers as users rather than individuals. And then the last bit of the talk was going to be a little more specific directions on what I think we should look for when I speculatively and dramatically extrapolate trends beyond what is probably reasonable from what the state of the art is today. Yeah, you have every right to disagree. I would assume that no other speaker will talk about these things. Scott Moore of Gitcoin may. And generally, I think that I hope that this is interesting to you because you can keep this in the back of your mind when you listen to other speakers and you see them talking in the, I'll say, this area here, extrapolating still a little bit, but you can try and track to what types of directions they're leading to in the many, many year timescale. You will see people talking about the future of governance. Governance is when a bunch of people, I define it as when a bunch of people combine their resources, try and determine what individuals want. They have to aggregate the priorities, and they have to deploy those resources against some shared goals. Whether this is the United States of America, or whether this is the DAO you created with two friends. These are still the types of things you want to do, or have to do. These tools are hundreds of years old. There are better proposals for these. I would particularly highlight MODA here, which is the Ministry of, I'm forgetting what it stands for. It's Taiwan's Digital Ministry. Taiwan is an incredible innovator in this space. And I hope that each of you I hope that each of you will try to imagine a world in which the governments are so effective in implementing tools for figuring out what citizens want that there's a robust two-sided market for citizenship where people both want to go to the governments where they are, where what they want is better represented, and where governments are competing over the most competent citizens to implement those policies. I would say drawing on something that is probably deep background or unknown to most of you, Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher, covered a lot of social theory and democracy and capitalism, proposed the direction, or extrapolated the trend that has led us to surveillance capitalism, saying that we used to have, as humans, robust debate that would actually impact policy. And the reason that that feels less of the case now is because it actually is less of the case now. The discussions that you have do not impact policy as robustly as they used to around the founding of America, for example. And what you should expect is that as you have commercialization of mass media or the poor representation of people's needs due to centralization of services, then you should expect the public to become disengaged, the criticality to cease being productive, and people to become passive consumers of the news, the goings on around them. I would say generally we can decentralize that better. We can empower people with better tools and organizations. I will not go into the future of economics. I would link to these two things and say, this is a very interesting combination that you should potentially consider if you're inclined to think about economics for fun. I'm not going to go into that future of work either. There is an idea of permissionless employment. You could imagine things that are much closer to the community organization or union side of the scale rather than the completely free market or bounty side of the scale. And then there's also some aspects of science where this is a critical decade or century, and how we represent what people want, how we prevent people from building things that we don't want, and how we empower collaboration in a decentralized way is going to be incredibly impactful. I have a lot of random things here. The top QR code is the QR code to the slides. I apologize that this ended up meandering a little bit more than intended. The speaker notes were, it turns out, going to be more helpful than I thought they were. I'm happy to stick around here until I enter the treehouse, and I'll start by taking questions.
As a skeptic, but also as a dev, part of your talk kind of struck a nerve with me, which is that NFTs have been useful for years. Why are large organizations with mouthpieces like yours still parroting this thing about like value despite uselessness? Like, they haven't been useless. They've never been useless.
I would agree with that. I apologize for implying or even explicitly mentioning a uselessness. I think that I would claim that the usefulness will grow exponentially, which may lead to an implication that it is not as useful now, not very useful now, but I would say that they are less useful now than they could be when you imagine more and more property, for instance, existing online, IP rights, for instance, being robustly represented, or cap tables being robustly represented by tokenized structures on blockchains.
Full agree. So why not just say they're about to be exponentially more useful?
Noted.
Just like,
noted. I will.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Just curious, not angry.
Yeah. No good reason. The fact that this is the first time I've given this talk, that's the reason.
Yeah, so like on the slide about Bitcoin, you also mentioned that blockchain is a very slow database, and I just want to ask you about like with all the scalability like initiatives that's going on, whether it's the merge or like new emerging blockchain projects, how do you compare like the future efficiency or performance of this like blockchain database versus like centralized traditional database?
Okay, the question was, how do I compare future performance of decentralized databases, future blockchains compared to centralized databases? I think personally that there will always be benefits to a centralized system. I think that there are systems like CRDTs or operational transforms that will give more competitive, well, I guess, as CRDTs get closer to operational transforms in their efficiency, if that holds meaning for anyone, we'll see breakthroughs in technologies, like infrastructural level utility to make decentralized systems more performant. But I would expect centralized systems maybe more of an asymptote where you can achieve in niche situations, but there are clear values to it that decentralization brings where you should care about that more than you would care about performance.
Yeah, I'm just more skeptic of like NFTs. So like I just don't understand like I can buy like the Mona Lisa, right? And like the reason it has value is because I have the ability to enjoy it myself. Like you are the only one that owns it, right? But then NFTs, like there is no differentiating in like how you like actually enjoy the content itself. So how come NFTs provide that value when everyone can just know it?
So I will note, NFTs for art is simply one mechanism of NFT. I would say that even within that scoped case, I would expect that there will be digital spaces where the fact that you can be verified by Twitter, for instance, as the owner of that particular NFT carries a significant social signal, and only you can enjoy that because of the way Twitter is following the protocol.